Hi guys, welcome back to the Mina Does Art Stuff YouTube channel. My name is Mina and on this channel we do art stuff. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Paul Rubens, I think it's pronounced Qaiomei watercolour. It's a 24 colour set. The rep from Paul Rubens who got in touch with me told me this is a student grade set, so we will check it out. It comes with this cardboard wrapper around it, and on the back you've got information about the paints, and there's also pigment information, opacity information, and I believe light fastness as well. So we will go through that when we are swatching. I get the feeling that some of these colours, the actual representation of the colour is not right. Like this one here is supposedly gamboge hue. I don't think it's actually going to be that colour, but we'll see. And there are some interesting pigments in some of these mixes, so we will chat about that as well. There's a couple of there's one long discontinued pigment that's included in here, and two discontinued pigments and one that is becoming discontinued, so it's interesting. So I guess we're going to find out when we swatch, so we'll talk about that, like I said, when we come to swatching. The actual palette itself is a really sturdy plastic palette. You can see where the pans go on the bottom there, and it's got nice plastic white with a bit of shine. Actually, it's a bit of a glittery iridescent. There we go, you can sort of see that on the plastic there. Sorry, I have to have my light on. I've been waiting and waiting for a day where there's enough natural light for me to film this. However, we are in the depths of winter now and it's not gonna happen, so unfortunately we're gonna have to use a lamp. And I'm already late in recording and publishing this video as it is, so I unfortunately can't wait any longer. And we open it up and we have this lovely 9-well mixing palette at the top, which is removable, and I'll show you that in a second. And the pans actually just come covered in a sticky plastic overlay, so it means there's no individual pans that need to be unwrapped, which is quite nice, so you can get right into it. This you can keep and stick on a piece of paper, which I probably will at some point. I just don't have anything to stick it on right now, so I'm just going to lightly place it on the cardboard cover, put that to one side. And that has all the same information that's on the back of the packaging as well, in terms of pigment information, light fastness, etc, etc. And here we have all 24 colours in their pans. The pans, I believe, are removable. It comes with this little plastic stick thing. So I think you're supposed to be able to use this to take out the pans. I'm not sure. Don't know if they're glued down at the back or not. Let's see, do any fall out? Okay, yeah, one of them's just popped out. So yeah, they're not glued down, it seems, but some of them are in there a little bit more snug. I think once you start using them and a bit of water gets under them, and they're going to stay stuck in a lot more secure. So if you did want to take anything out, I'd suggest trying to do that before you start painting with them. And then there's a little gap here at the edge where you can stick this in and pop out the palette, which actually makes it easy to like wash the palette if you want to clean it off, or if you want to use the actual lid as extra mixing space, you can also do that. You can, if you're going to set this out on your table. One thing this palette doesn't have, which doesn't particularly bother me, but just so you are aware, there's no thumb ring on the back of the palette like a lot of these palettes have. It's just a unique style of palette. And yeah, I've already prepared a swatch page on some, this is 100% cotton paper. It is by Zen Art Supplies, 100% cotton, cold pressed. 140 pounds, 300 GSM, 8x8 inch square. Anyway, 100% cotton, and we're gonna do some swatchy swatch. So I've already labeled everything. I will go through and talk about the pigment information and light fastness and transparency information that they've included on the packaging, which is interesting. So it looks like most of these pigments are transparent. Let me just double check something. Okay, there's no explanation as to what the symbols mean, so I'm just going to take a guess. I'm going to say that the white squares are going to be transparent and the black squares are meant to be opaque, just based on the colours that they're on, which is interesting. And then we've got light fastness stars, most of these are 4 stars. The white is 5-star. Everything else that I can see is 4 stars. Let me just go through quickly. Burnt Sienna's 5. Raw Umber, Van Dyke Brown are also 5, and so is the Ivory Black. So pretty much everything is a 4-star light fastness other than white, Burnt Sienna, Raw Umber, Van Dyke Brown and Ivory Black are 5. Okay, so I won't have to go. So we're just going to stick to pigment information while we're swatching here. I'm just going to grab a size 6 brush, round brush, and I haven't pre-wet the palette, so we're just going to go straight into it and see how they go. So this first one here is Chinese White, PW4. I don't have a lot of experience with PW4, so I don't know what this one's going to be like. I mean, to be fair, white watercolour has its uses, don't get me wrong, it's definitely got its uses, but it's not something I would necessarily recommend for a beginner if you're just learning watercolour techniques and stuff, because I feel like, especially if you come at it from other mediums like acrylics or oils where you use white a lot, it can become a bit of a crutch, and I think it's good to learn proper, I guess I said proper, like traditional techniques, and then learn how to adapt those original, like traditional techniques into your styles, and that may include using white, but I feel like initially it's probably best to learn some of the basics before adding white to your palette, if that makes sense. Right, so next up we have Lemon Yellow Hue. This is PY175. Now this is a pigment that you can find in artist grade watercolours as well. It's a really lovely bright lemony yellow colour. I think Daniel Smith has a lemon yellow which is made of PY175. I know there's a few other brands that do as well. I think Winsor and Newton have, I think their Winsor Lemon is PY175. Well, they have a yellow with PY175 in it. Next up we have Cadmium Yellow Pale Hue, which is a mixture of PY65 and the PY175, which we just painted out in the square before. So this is a warmer yellow. Okay, now our next colour is Cadmium Yellow Hue. It's a mixture of PY97 and PY65. Unfortunately, I kind of made a bit of an error when drawing up this swatch chart and wrote it and skipped over this one. So it's had to be added at the bottom here. So hopefully you can see that. That's my error. I will be honest, I didn't want to waste the paper and rewrite out the whole thing again, so we're just going to roll with it. And next up we have Gamboge Hue. This is made with PY153. Now this is an interesting pigment because I've heard and seen many places that this pigment is supposedly discontinued. However, I still see it used by some paint manufacturers. Like I've seen it in some paints by Sennelier. That's the only one I can think of off the top of my head, but I've definitely seen it in other companies' paints as well. So it's interesting. I'm not sure what's going on with PY153, if it's actually discontinued or if there's like a new source of it. But it's a really lovely transparent warm yellow. It's almost got like a quinacridone gold kind of hue to it with this one, this particular version. Next up we have Cadmium Red Pale Hue. This is PY65 and I think it's maybe PR255. It's labelled on the packaging as PY255. I think that might be an error. It's a really nice sort of fire engine, sort of warmish orangey red. Okay, and then we have cadmium red hue, which is PR149 and PR255. So again, here they've got it as PR255, which is why I think the other one is an error. Okay. This is more of a middle red sort of colour. Oh, sorry, splash a bit of red into that white. And then next up we have cadmium red deep hue. This is a mixture of PR188, which is typically used for Scarlet Lake, and PR254, which I can't remember the traditional name for that one, but it is, I believe in Winsor & Newton that's like their Winsor red colour. A slightly cooler leaning red. It's definitely still very much a red colour. Alright, next up we have Permanent Rose. So it's like a pinkish, magenta-ish colour typically. Also that. This is a PV19, so it's single pigment. That's a beautiful pink colour. Next up we have Alizarin Crimson Hue, and this is an interesting one because it is made of pigment PR206, and that has recently been announced as being a pigment that's being discontinued. However, Winsor & Newton used PR206 for their Alizarin Crimson Hue, so it'll be interesting to see what this one looks like. And in its, I guess, original form or traditional form, PR206 is known as by several names: brown madder, quinacridone maroon, madder brown, all sorts of different names, but this is definitely more on the red side than on the earthier brown side. So I'd say it's probably more similar to the Alizarin Crimson, Permanent Alizarin Crimson by Winsor & Newton. This is seeing a lot of similarities with Winsor & Newton, which is interesting. It's a beautiful Alizarin Crimson colour though. Then next up we have Purple Lake. This is also an interesting, supposedly discontinued pigment called PR88, otherwise known as Theo Indigo Violet. I know Da Vinci is one of the only other commercially available, or commercially produced watercolours that offers this pigment. Otherwise, the only other place you can get this pigment is through some handmade watercolour artists who have some of this pigment and are able to make paint with it. So it's interesting that they've used that for this paint. This is Purple Lake. I don't know much about this pigment other than it's very pretty and it's purple, but yeah, I just know that it's been discontinued a long time ago, and like I said, Da Vinci's Theo Indigo Violet is the only other sort of mass-produced paint, I guess, or factory-made paint that offers that pigment. Okay, I'm gonna move this around like this so I can get everything on screen. Okay, so now we're moving into our blues. We're starting with Cerulean Blue Hue, which is PB15. Probably has some white mixed in there. PB15 is a phthalo, and phthalos are very transparent, but this one here in the pan you can tell has some white. It's a Cerulean Blue Hue. That's the other thing you can tell with this one as being student grade compared to an artist grade one, is it has a lot of hues, which isn't a bad thing, but the hues are to replicate colours where the original pigments would be a lot more expensive, like the cadmiums and ceruleans and cobalts are much more expensive pigments to procure. So if you had originals, this, you know, the paints would be more expensive as well. So next up we have Cobalt Blue Hue again, and this is PB29 and PW5. So this is a mixture of ultramarine blue with a bit of white to create a cobalt blue hue. It's not a bad one, to be fair. Cobalt blue and ultramarine are very close in hue anyway. Next up we have ultramarine, PB29. Be interesting to see how that one, if it granulates at all. I can see a little bit coming through, so we'll see when it dries. Then next up we have Intense Blue, PB15, Phthalo Blue. Sorry, we're just doing indigo. The camera turned off there for a second, so I'm not sure how much of this it missed. But we're working on indigo at the moment, so that's PB15, PBK6 and PB29. So it's a very sort of dark green leaning indigo. Alright, and then next up we have Sap Green. This is a mixture of PG36 and PO49, which is very interesting because there again, if you've been in the watercolour world for a while, you know that PO49 has been discontinued for quite some time now. It became discontinued a few years before I started with watercolours, so it's been a while that it's been discontinued. And so it's interesting to see it popping back up. I don't know if they've got a new source for it or what, but they have it here in a couple of their mixes, in a couple of their greens. So they've got it in their Sap Green, which is a very bright Sap Green. I'd say it's more similar to, it's actually very similar to Sennelier's Olive Green. And then next up after that we have Hooker's Green Light, which is PB15, so Phthalo Blue, PO49 again, that original Quin Gold, and PG7. And then next up we have Emerald. Usually this would just be a phthalo green, but this one is PG7, so phthalo green, mixed with PY175, so that lemon yellow. So it should be a slightly more yellow leaning with phthalo. Still very garish and bright. Definitely more of a mixing colour on a palette than something I would use straight from the pan. Alright, next up we have Burnt Sienna into the earth tones. Interestingly, no yellow ochre, which you would normally see in a palette, in like a standard palette. So there's no yellow ochre in this palette, which I don't think is that bad because the gamboge hue is quite a nice earthy sort of colour. Burnt Sienna PR101. It's a very traditional looking orange burnt sienna, from like a PR101 version anyway. Then we have Raw Umber. Really don't like raw umbers personally, but we'll see what this one's like. This is a mixture of PBR7 and PY42, so sort of brown and a yellow ochre pigment. Yeah, I don't know what it is about raw umber, it's just not for me. I would have much preferred to have a raw sienna or yellow ochre than a raw umber personally, but that's just my preferences. I know lots of artists really enjoy having a raw umber, so if it works for you, then great. Okay, final three. We have Van Dyke Brown, which again is an interesting one to include on a sort of student palette. It's not a massively common colour to include in like a beginner palette type of situation. So this is PR 101 and PBR 7. It's a very nice dark brown, kind of almost like a sepia. And then next up we have Burnt Umber, PY42 and PBR7. So same as the raw umber, but with the pigments flipped, which is interesting. I just thought it'd be the other way around, but it's a nice dark warm brown. Feels a bit opaque compared to what I would typically expect from a burnt umber. And then we have Ivory Black to round out the palette. And again, with black, as with white, I don't know. There again, I feel like a Payne's grey or something would be much more useful, or even neutral tint. There again to say there's nothing wrong with using black in watercolour, plenty of artists do. I just think, again, it's good to learn without the crutch of using a black and white, learning the basics, and then, you know, once you know some of the basics and why they are the way they, you know, why those rules are in place, as it were, why those traditional rules exist, learn a bit of colour theory, and then if you want to add black and white to your palette, go ahead. But then again, that's just my personal opinion. That's not to say it's right or wrong. Alright, I'm just gonna let this dry and then we'll come back and take a look at everything up close. So we are back now. Swatches are dry. First off the bat, I will say that some of these swatches, I don't know if you can see that there on the Gamboge, Alizarin Crimson and the Purple Lake. You see they've got a slight shine. There we go, you can see that there. In the mass tone at the top of the swatches. A couple of the others have it as well. The Van Dyke Brown has a bit, Sap Green, I think even the Intense Blue. I think that's just the other two reds as well also have a little bit there, and the Permanent Rose. I think that's just something you're going to have to watch out for with a student grade set, and this one in particular seems to have this as a bit of an issue, that your really dark areas of colour, if you're going in one layer, could end up being a little bit shiny when dry. Now that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing, it's just something to know about. Most people don't like that in their watercolours. They want their watercolours to be matte when finished and not have this like shine to them. But that's usually a sign of something to do with the binder, should I say. Okay, I'm trying to think of the right words. Yeah, it's something to do with the binder. Either there's a lot of binder, or there's one of the components of the binder that they use is causing this shininess to show up. Like I said, it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. It doesn't necessarily denote a poor quality product. It's just something to be aware of. There are some artist grade watercolors that can have that shine as well. It can affect some pigments more than others, because some pigments require a higher binder ratio to bind the pigment correctly or enough for it to work. So it's just something to bear in mind. Okay, so I'm going to do a bit of close-up of all the different swatches. We've got Chinese whites, lemon yellow hue, cadmium yellow pale hue, and we had the cadmium yellow hue down there. Gamboge, cadmium red pale, cad red, cadmium red deep, permanent rose, alizarin crimson, purple lake, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine, intense blue, indigo, which I feel like this indigo looks more like a Payne's grey than an indigo to me, sap green, hooker's green light, emerald, burnt sienna, raw umber, which, to be fair, now that it's dry I don't mind it as much, Van Dyke brown, burnt umber and ivory black. So that's this set. I'd say it's a little bit leaning, it's a little bit heavy on the pinks and reds, like there's quite a lot. You could probably do with one less red in this. You've got Cad Red Pale, just regular red, and then deep. You could probably do without the red, you just have the pale and the deep, and then you could probably mix this one from those two. I just feel like it's one too many reds, and even with the yellows, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 yellows. You could probably get away with not even having this one, and you'd be fine with just those 3 yellows. So I feel like there's a couple of colors they could have taken out and replaced with different colors. Like it would have been nice to have had like a turquoise color in there, and maybe a yellow ochre. I don't think you need Van Dyke Brown and Burnt Umber. They're very similar, and they'd probably serve a similar purpose on a palette. You could have a yellow ochre instead. I just feel like some of the color choices could have been different, shall I say, not necessarily better. It'd be good to have had like a dioxazine violet in here. It's a better mixing purple. I don't know, just some thoughts on things that I would have maybe changed, or maybe have had like a more true magenta instead of these 3 reds. The Permanent Rose is fine, but like a PR 122, like quinacridone magenta would have been nice to have. But I think that's a more expensive pigment, which is probably why it's not included. But yeah, so that's just my thoughts on this palette. I think it's a great introductory palette. You have traditional names being used, which is great for a beginner who might be following tutorials or videos on YouTube or something where the artists they are following along with or learning from more than likely will be referring to colours that they have on their palette, and so these the colour naming reflects the professional artist quality brands and their way of naming colours. So it's, you know, they call it cerulean blue hue, they're not calling it sky blue, which a lot of student grade brands might call that colour sky blue instead of cerulean blue. But if you're following a tutorial from someone who is using artist grade paints, they would probably use the term cerulean blue, and therefore it makes it easier to follow along with when you're learning, shall I say. So I like that about it. They haven't used lots of like cutesy names, which, as fun as those are, it's really hard if you're trying to learn to sort of figure out what colours someone is referring to when they're using these more traditional names. Alright, that's my opinion on these. I will have a link down below to where you can purchase them. I think they are great quality for the pigments that are used. Like I said, some interesting pigment choices with some that have been announced as being discontinued or have been discontinued for a while already. But other than that, I'd say it's a great quality set of paints. They don't look chalky, they don't look weak, they're easy to re-wet. Like you saw, I didn't pre-wet the palette, so if I'd pre-wet them it probably would have been quicker to pick up pigment. And yeah, I think they're great as based on just this initial swatching test that I did. So yeah, if it's something you're looking for to get for a beginner, if you can get a good price on them, I definitely would say worth getting. Like I said, a great beginner set, and yeah, I wouldn't pay a massive amount for these, but I don't know what they're going for at the moment on Amazon, but if you keep an eye out for like a sale or something, I think they could be a really good bet. Alright, thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you guys again soon. Take care. Bye!